My name is Matt Lindstrom. I direct the McCarthy Center, Eugene McCarthy Center for Public Policy and Civic Engagement. Very pleased to have with us Dr. Mitch Pearlstein, who will be introduced in a little bit by Kate Paul, who works for the McCarthy Center. I just want to do a quick thank you to SFCT, Students Fostering Conservative Thought, for co-sponsoring this event. And the McCarthy Center constantly looks to partner with student clubs for really everything we do. So if you're connected to another club or you have ideas for programming, let us know. We're pretty well booked up for the spring, but we have next year, so that's important. If you haven't been to a Politics and a Pint before, we have these, they're typically a monthly event, and the idea is to be fairly casual. So, you know, if you want to grab another piece of pizza midway, no problem. You want to fill up with a beverage, no problem. Come and go, no pop quizzes. You know, we're pretty informal here. We do have some books. Dr. Pearlstein brought several books up, and my understanding is he has a very special student rate discount. So take advantage of that. It's a fantastic book. I will conclude by giving our distinguished guest the coveted McCarthy Center Politics and a Pint mug, which all the participants for these events get. It's a one-of-a-kind deal.
This is where I get teary-eyed.
This is where, yeah, exactly.
Thank
so you put that in your fine china collection or something. All right, enough of me. Kate will come up here and introduce our guest.
All right, well, thanks again for everyone for coming today. Today, the McCarthy Center has the privilege of hosting a very distinguished guest. Minnesota native Dr. Mitch Pearlstein is the president and founder of the Center for the American Experiment. Based out of Minneapolis, the center is a nonpartisan public policy and educational institution that brings conservative and free market ideas to bear on the hardest problems facing Minnesota and the nation. Dr. Pearlstein's impressive career ranges from serving for 2 years in the U.S. Department of Education during the Reagan and Bush administrations to spending 4 years as an editorial writer and columnist for the Pioneer Press. Along with other remarkable accomplishments throughout the years, Dr. Pearlstein has authored and co-authored several books. In his newest and most important book, From Family Collapse to America's Decline, Dr. Pearlstein explores the educational, economic, and social costs of family fragmentation. Paul Peterson of Harvard University has praised the book, stating, "Not since the 1965 Moynihan Report has anyone written so frankly, so soberly, so reasonably, or so persuasively on the devastating social consequences of single-parent families." Again, we are so excited to have him here today, so please welcome Mitch Pearlstein.
Afternoon, all. Do I need this? Is this being recorded, so I need this, or you can hear me this way? Oh, I'll use it. That was where's Kate? That was a real nice introduction, though. What she could have added was that I'm Jewish and I run a conservative think tank. That's not the punchline. My wife is an ordained Episcopal deacon who used to run homeless programs for a Lutheran church, and we sent all the kids to Catholic schools. And the line works just about every time. Great pleasure to be at St. John's and St. Ben's. Matt, thank you very much. See the display for Gene McCarthy. So I have to tell you my Gene McCarthy story. I worked for him in a fashion. In 1968, when I was spending the summer at UCLA, when he was running for president, and I wound up being responsible for an airport rally at LA International. And a couple of hours or a day or so before this big rally that we had advertised, I went to see the site, did it a bit backwards, and realized that the parking lot might have had 7 spaces. So I was responsible for perhaps the largest traffic jam on Sepulveda Boulevard ever in California. If I move this way, is that the problem? The book. This is serious stuff. may as well throw in a couple of caveats right from the start. I'm in my second and ultimate marriage. I used to say my second and last marriage, but my wife didn't like the locution. She's in her second and ultimate marriage. Stuff happens. She was a single mother for a long time. The 3 boys from her previous life are now 40, 38, and 36, and we have a daughter we adopted. There are millions of single mothers out there and single fathers whose kids are doing just fine. There are millions and millions of kids growing up under the best of circumstances who are not doing fine. But whenever we talk about this subject, it has to be understood we're talking about odds and averages. And decidedly, I would argue that given that the United States has the highest family fragmentation rate in the industrialized world, that is not good. And by family fragmentation, I am talking about kids born out of wedlock, divorce, separation, and people moving in and out, churning in and out of cohabiting relationships. You add it all up, and there may not be another nation in the industrialized world, I don't think there is, where the numbers are so high. I have been dealing with this subject, and if I say something, I'm going to go about 20 minutes, I think, and stop me if I go long. Something that just doesn't make sense, feel free to jump in. I've been dealing with this subject since the late 70s. I wrote a paper as a graduate student talking about academic values in liberal orthodoxy. And liberal orthodoxy was the term I used at the time for political correctness. I don't know if the term was in general use at the time. And one of the emphases of that paper had to do with a man's name you had just heard, Paul Peterson, talking about Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who died about 8 years ago, had been United States Senator from New York for a long time. He was the senator from New York before Hillary was the senator. And he had been in Democratic lives and he had been in Republican lives. And he wrote, when he was in the Johnson administration, a paper arguing, so we're now talking about 1965, arguing that the breakdown of marriage in the black community was a disaster. And he was just pilloried for saying that, for writing that. I assure you there wasn't a racist punctuation mark in that report. It was a very progressive report. We can talk about how and why. But the number he used for the out-of-wedlock birth rate in the African American community at that time, he used 1963 data, was 23.6%. He was pilloried, though, as I say, by journalists, by civil rights leaders, by other politicians, undercut by people in his own administration. And I would argue that for upwards of the next 20 years, there wasn't very much said publicly about this issue. People were frightened. I point this out in part to say that the out-of-wedlock birth rate now in the African American community is over 70%. It's about 73%. The out-of-wedlock birth rate in the white community is higher now at about 30% than what it was when Moynihan wrote about the African American community in the mid-1960s. One of the points being, when we don't have the courage to talk about the really tough stuff, things get worse. Summary of the numbers. I just gave you a couple. About 40% of all American kids are now born out of wedlock. About 30% in the white community. About 50% in the Hispanic community, and as I say, a little over 70% now. Last number I heard was 73 in the African American community. When it comes to marriage and divorce, These are more difficult numbers to calculate for technical reasons I can barely understand, but my understanding is that about 40% of all first marriages now end in divorce, and for subsequent marriages, second and third and the like, that number is closer to 50%. Now, at the heart of my argument, which I'll get to, is that all of this, among other bad things, is leading to deepening class divisions in this country, in a nation that never has really been very fond of looking at itself in terms of class and a lack of mobility. But when combined with worldwide economic changes which demand that a person bring something to the employment table, some skill, otherwise he or she may not do all that well, we are at risk of seeing in our nation, in our communities, greater gulfs between those who are rich and somewhat poor and very poor. And we'll get to some of those details as well. And the point that comes immediately out of that is that one has to understand I am not just talking about poor people. I am not just talking about people of color. I'm talking about the whole of the nation. I have two friends who are in this line of work, Brad Wilcox at the University of Virginia and his colleague Elizabeth Marquardt at the Institute for American Values in New York, though she lives in Chicago, who wrote a paper about, I would say about 15, 16 months ago now, where they calculated, and this is on target, that when one talks about the great American middle, the 58% of American adults who have a high school diploma but not a four-year college degree, when it comes to their patterns for bringing babies into this world, in or out of marriage, getting married or not, getting divorced or not, their patterns are increasingly resembling those of lower income people. If you go back maybe just 20 years, 30 years certainly, their patterns, the people in the middle, were more likely to resemble folks who were more affluent. Meaning, we have lots and lots of kids growing up under tough circumstances. Do people talk about this? Do people acknowledge this? And I would argue, not nearly adequately. And there are perversely wonderful examples of this. One of my favorites is a book called Class and Schools by a former New York Times reporter, Richard Rothstein, who's now a teacher's college at Columbia and associated with another think tank. He wrote a book from the left, his book, that is in many ways my book. I'm on the right, he's on the left, with this big difference. He argues that as long as so many kids are growing up in poverty, in tough circumstances, you could have all the fine education policies in the world and they won't be adequate. That's what I argue. But throughout the entire book, there are only two oblique references to single parents or kids growing up with only one parent. It's as if all these households are poor, all these families are poor just because. My argument is that a very large reason that so many families are poor and kids are having troubles is that we have as much as many out of wedlock births as we do, as many divorces as we do. I can go through a bit of a history, a bit of a motion picture of how we have gotten to this stage, but let me just jump because I want to have some conversation. One of the, I would argue, parts of the book that I think is a contribution has to do, let me back up first. At the core of the book, I connect 5 dots. Family fragmentation rates, the highest in the world here, lead to very high fragmentation rates, lead to educational weaknesses, which are inescapable, which lead to economic weaknesses, which are inescapable, which leads to a loss of economic competitiveness, but not just in the nation as a whole, but as I've suggested, on the part of many individuals, leading to the final dot, which is deepening class divisions in our nation. On the specific question of education that I want to hit at, there's the term out there that you may have heard, no excuses. We know what works in school, and there are no excuses if kids do poorly. Now, the focus is generally not on the students. The focus is on the schools. And the left makes this argument in many ways, and the right makes this argument in many ways. The left does it by saying, look, we know what programs work, and if we just spent more money supporting these teachers in these schools, all kids can do much better. I'm paraphrasing, a bit of a caricature, but you get the idea. On the right, folks are saying, and people at the Heritage Foundation, for example, have done this. I'm great friends with the people at Heritage, great conservative think tank in Washington, but on this I think they're wrong. They say, look, we know what works. We know what schools are best for helping kids in need, and if we just had more of those schools, which means more vouchers, which I support, for private schools, and tax credits, which I support for private schools, and charter schools, which I support, and if somehow you get rid of those teacher unions, then we will be fine, because we know what works, no excuses. And both sides are wrong, because I start from the premise that there are a lot more kids out there than we believe or that we fear, who, because of the very difficult home lives in which they are growing up, just find it too hard to concentrate well enough, long enough, to work hard enough, long enough, to do adequately well in school. Now, I recognize by saying what I just did that I can be accused of making excuses. I can be accused of lowering the bar, which doesn't do anybody any good. I can be accused of viewing the world through a therapeutic prism. That's not good either, but I'm afraid I'm right. And I have yet to speak at some length with a teacher, public school teacher, who doesn't agree with me. I'm not necessarily talking about kids having problems that might show up in a psychiatric or a psychological textbook as something identified and real. But on balance, there are lots and lots of kids suffering what are known, for example, as father wounds. Kids growing up without their daddies and sometimes without their mommies. Or kids in a neighborhood where there are hardly any married couples to be found. So one asks the question, can you really expect those kids to do well enough in school? And you also ask the question, who is teaching those boys to become men? Who is teaching those boys to become good fathers, good husbands? Now, I make it real clear that there are, and I'm jumping over some of the economic stuff because I want to get to the conversation, make it real clear that there are no solutions, certainly no solutions, but no remedies in this book as robust as the problems described. But that doesn't mean we're not obliged to try. It also means if you're writing a book, the editor is going to demand you have at least a chapter, maybe two, on how to fix this stuff. And I have friends who have written the most brilliant analyses of various problems, and they add a chapter at the end, how to fix it, and let's just say the earlier parts of the book are more compelling than the latter parts of the book. But I do devote two chapters, one to ways of improving education in light of all of this, and one in terms of strengthening marriage in light of all of this. And at the heart, let me point to two things. I'm going to talk about boys, and I'm going to talk about people who've been in prison. There's a terrific journalist, still alive, though I do believe essentially retired. He may be teaching at Duke. Bill Raspberry, William Raspberry, Pulitzer Prize winner, African-American, Washington Post, who I used to know pretty well. And he would write a lot about these kinds of issues. He was a very brave chap. Politically, he was a good moderate, but wherever he found good arguments, he gave credit. He was out here meeting the cities upwards of 20 years ago, and he was asked by someone, and the subject on the table that day was something like poverty, something real big. And he was asked, where do you start? And he said, well, the problem is so big you can start just about any place. But if he had to choose one spot, he would say, start with the boys. And I agree, which is not to say one shouldn't be alert to girls and women, but the boys become the men that women do not want to marry, and for very good reasons, quite frequently. So what might help with the boys? Well, I come back to questions of education and what kinds of education, and it occurs to me that if a kid is suffering again disruption in his home life, father wounds, mother wounds, that the kind of education that might work for him would be the kinds of schools often described as paternalistic. Talking about, if you're familiar with these kinds of places, and they're often charter schools, so they don't have to deal with the regulations and rules of a regular district public school. KIPP academies, for example, very disciplined, very demanding, no excuses. And there's evidence to show that these kids generally do better, on average, always on average, than many kids, similar circumstances in other schools. Progressive ideas in education and paternalism don't match up real well. And for those same kids, it seems to me, it might work for many of them, not all, but many, that the kind of nurturing you could get more likely in a religious school, let's say a Catholic school. I'm very fond of Catholic schools. That for many kids, that kind of educational experience might work better for them. So you ask, how does this translate into policy? Well, it seems to me one should be supportive of opportunities for low-income kids to get that kind of education, meaning vouchers or tax credits. And we can come back to questions of education. It is impossible, though, to imagine marriage being resurrected particularly in inner cities, as long as so many men are in jail, or in prison, or they're dead. Or if they get out, when they get out, and most people get out, they have records, by definition. And if you have a record, it is very difficult to get a good job. And if it's very difficult to get a good job, it's tough to build a career. And again, you may not be very marriageable in the eyes of a lot of women. So what to do about that? Conservatives, I'm afraid, don't necessarily grasp this very well, because on the one hand, they're saying, get thee married. They want more people married. On the other hand, they say, lock them up if people do bad things. And generally people, when they're locked up, it's because they have indeed done bad things. But we have to find a way beyond simply hoping, working towards the day where fewer people are committing crime. In many ways, we have made progress in the last several decades where that is concerned. But once guys get out, how to cleanse their names so they have a fighting chance to get a good job and build a career and be marriageable, while all the time, without question, protecting public safety. And there are ways of making some dents there, and we can talk about that. But the final point I would make, at the risk of name dropping, I've already name-dropped Gene McCarthy. Back when I was at the Pioneer Press as an editorial writer and columnist in the mid-1980s, I had a chance to interview Bill Bennett when he was Secretary of Education. This was in 1986, and it was a full year before I wound up working at the department, but in '86 I had no clue that I would be. How many people listened to Bill Bennett in the morning on his show or read the Book of Virtues or some such? Bill was the secretary. Bill is a great scholar, political player, talk show host, lawyer, PhD in philosophy, very talented chap. Plus, a very good football player. And my other major name dropping is before my body went bad, I had insinuated myself into his famous touch football game in Washington in 1988. And so we have that male bonding moment. And it would be in poor taste for me to tell you how many times I intercepted him, but if you want to ask afterwards, that is all right. So I was interviewing the secretary, and because I was an editorial writer, not just a reporter, I could ask all these big questions. I was having a fine conversation with him, dealing with subjects not terribly different from what we're talking about now. And I saw his aide after about 25 minutes, who turns out to be a great friend now, look at his watch. And I knew that meant I had one question left, so I had to make it a good one. So I said, Mr. Secretary, seems to me what we have been talking about are not a bunch of programs and budgets and rules and regulations and money and that kind of thing. We've been talking about the very culture. How do you go about changing the very culture? And he said it was a real good question. He had been thinking about it a lot. And the best answer he had was that you say what you believe in your heart to be true, and you say it over and over and over again. And without slighting what I have tried to do over the last, say, 30 years where this subject is concerned, I'd like to think I've done more than simply express my views in that way, but that is central. That is central. And it is fascinating the number of people who thoroughly agree with me, but for whatever reason, they're reluctant to talk about these things publicly. And I'm here in a university, and the question I have, it's more of a question than an assertion, though the assertion goes first. I would argue that in much of American higher education, campuses are not necessarily the best place, often clearly not the best place to talk about really tough issues, but campuses are often the worst places in the United States. People get intimidated, the PC, and the rest. So I'd be curious to hear what you folks think about this. But these are just terribly difficult questions. One must handle them not just with courage, but with grace, and that is what I have tried to do. So with that, what do you want to talk about? That is a good question, and I actually deal with that in a fashion in the book. It must be about 2/3 into it, where I realized I haven't answered your question. I'm talking about policy and a bunch of stuff. And I've been involved in the fatherhood movement, the marriage movement for a long time. And I made it clear in the book, which, by the way, special student rate, $10, marked down from $27.95, that, look, I think it's a great thing if fathers want to have quality time with their kids, take them to soccer matches and ball games and watch them. It is a great thing if they want to help with the diapering, but that's between a guy and his wife and their God. I really don't care. My conception, for the purposes of the problems I am describing, is that if you're familiar with the Woody Allen line, 80% of life is showing up, I just want them there. They don't have to be the most sensitive fellows. They don't have to help with the vacuuming. They don't have to make certain that they have truly quality time with their kids. I just want them there. If they want to do those other things, terrific. I just want them there. Look, has to do with father figures, and can a child, generally speaking, do as well to have a father figure in his life in a serious way, do just as well as he might or she might if the kid was growing up under the same roof with a biological mother and a father. And what I would say is, it is wonderful for a kid growing up without a father at home, and you can say the same thing about mothers, to have a responsible, terrific guy looking after him, but it's not the same thing. Always on average. Always on average. And the research is pretty clear, very clear, I would argue, that whatever the realm is, educational performance, mental illness, criminal activity, drug use, early sexual initiation, whatever the realm is, on average, kids do better if they are growing up with both of their biological parents living under the same roofs. Are there many, many, many exceptions to this? By definition. But it is too easy for some people to gainsay the importance of marriage and the importance of having the two parents with this kid as the kid grows up. Yes, sir. These are good questions. It is fair to say that, by definition, lots of teachers have been doing a lot more in those areas for a long time. Generally speaking, is it adequate? No. The kinds of, and I'll go back to the point I was making before, the kinds of schools and the kinds of teachers who are most inclined to provide that kind of support, guidance, nurturance. And these teachers can be found every place, but they're most likely, it seems to me, to be found in religious schools, where teaching is a ministry. It's a ministry for many public school teachers, but I'm partial to ministries in religious schools. I interviewed once a nun who was the principal of an elementary school in West St. Paul. And I asked, what's the mission of your school? And she said something like, to manifest God's love in every child. Now, as mission statements go, that's a pretty good one. That's pretty meaty. You can envision it, as opposed to mission statements in other kinds of institutions. And that comes back to questions of ministry. I've learned something about ministries from my wife. It doesn't work necessarily academically terrifically well to expect teachers, in addition to teaching kids how to read, write, compute, and the rest, to expect them to be mommies and daddies. But we certainly have moved in that direction to a significant degree, and not adequately, obviously. Yes, sir. Yeah.
The whole issue surrounding deadbeat dads can sometimes be separated from the issue with single mothers.
Mhm.
Single mothers are stigmatized against in society. Often they're have lower opportunity for different jobs. Research from Ivy Kenley from the 70s and 80s shows that black single mothers are extremely stigmatized against by employers because they contradictorily think that they're hard workers because they want to support their family, but on the other hand, they're unreliable. So the stigmatization of single mothers causes issues that if there are, like you said, 40% of children in the United States born out of wedlock, what do we do with these 40% of children who are just probably not going to get father figures for the rest of their life, but then are going to be moving into families where statistics show that if you're raised in a single home, you're a lot more likely to leave a single home. What do we do to make that?
Chapters 5 and 6 is one answer. I don't mean to be entirely glib. When you talk about a kid being born out of wedlock and chances are will not have a father figure for the rest of his life, that's not necessarily true. Lots of, it'll sound a bit like I'm arguing against myself, but I'm not. One of the things that has been learned in recent years, that for lots and lots of low-income mothers who have babies out of wedlock, they are at the time of the birth romantically involved with the father. And many of them say, we do plan on getting married, but for a variety of reasons, they don't. Is there a stigma attached to out of wedlock births? One of the arguments in the book is not nearly what it was. How in the world can there be that kind of stigma that we once dealt with, that single mothers had to deal with, when the numbers are such, when everyone in a community almost is growing up without a father at home? The research shows, by the way, and I can personalize this, when my wife and I got married a bit more than 20 years ago, my stepsons were then, when we got engaged, they were then about 19, 17, 15. And I remember having lunch with a friend, quite religiously animated friend, and he was saying, God, this is good. The boys now will have a father figure, a father at home. And I said, yeah, I'm very pleased about that. Putting aside that my wife's ex-husband lived about 5 miles away, and so the boys had a father around. What I didn't, and then he moved to California, what I didn't know at the time was that for many kids who are growing up in step families, they wind up having educational performances and other problems, pathologies if you like, essentially at the same rate as kids growing up in single-parent homes. I suspect, whenever talking about this stuff, is very personal. I suspect there are people in this room who grew up in those kinds of situations. A parent had a new love interest. How does the kid deal with that? What kind of allegiance, love, does the kid have to this new boyfriend or even the stepfather? What happens when the relationship breaks up and the man who the kids were becoming attached to is no longer there, and all of a sudden there's another boyfriend or girlfriend, as the case may be? This is all very, very difficult, and if you wanted to get real stark, the rate of girls and boys being abused by boyfriends, those rates are far higher than the rates of kids obviously being abused by their biological parents. Now, you can't say you shouldn't have been married, go get yourself married. It doesn't work that way. This is a very, very difficult issue, but we have to simply do better. Yes, sir. You're like in stereo, these two guys here. I like that. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Good question. There are various ways of calculating numbers about what high fragmentation rates, and that's the new term of art if you haven't figured it out by now, for family breakdown. For some reason people like talking about fragmentation, so we talk about fragmentation. There are various ways of looking at it. The simplest way, I suspect, and we deal with it in the book, would be to just count up all the social services, all the social welfare programs that are there, that we take advantage of, largely because of kids growing up in single-parent homes, single parents needing services. That's a real big number. But somehow our nation survives that. For me, the more important argument goes something like this. If growing up in these circumstances leads to weaker academic performance on average, as it does, and there is research to show that the store of mathematical and scientific knowledge in a society is very important when it comes to innovation. And if lots and lots of kids growing up in single-parent homes are not doing all that well in math and science, in the same way they're not doing well in other areas, then the nation as a whole suffers when it comes to matters of business enterprise, innovation, and the rest. But even then, I would say, look, the United States is the biggest economy in the world. I don't see that changing anytime soon. We have been doing pretty well, even with these bad numbers. We can survive. But the heart and soul here is, while our gross national product may be in decent shape, when it comes to real live individuals, they will be doing, in many instances, and in many instances because of family breakdown, less well in school, and they will have weaker careers as such. And when you combine this, as I teased before, with globalization, everybody has to have a skill to bring to the table. You add it all up, and this is where I argue that family breakdown is leading to these deepening class divisions, distances in terms of income and where people go to school and the kinds of lives they live between those who are doing it the old-fashioned way on average, meaning they get a good education, they get a job, they get married, and then they have children. But lots and lots of people are not doing it in that way, and those kids on average are not doing as well. There has been, in some ways, just coincidental with the release of the book, which came out in August, September, a great increase in attention to these questions of social division. The Occupy movement is part of it. Tea Party groups are part of it. Some really good pieces of writing. If you're familiar with Charles Murray, his new book, Coming Apart, deals with it. We have never in this country viewed ourselves as a nation of distinct classes. You go back and you read Tocqueville and everybody is on the same level and so on and so forth. This is tough. This is tough stuff. Yes, sir. Oh, I do. Well, it's a fair question. But the biggest problem we have when it comes to fragmentation is not missing mothers, it's missing fathers. So hence the focus of the book and what I've been talking about. But you are indeed right. something like, I have it in the book, though I really don't believe it, about 1/6 of all single parents are actually men. One of the reasons that there are so many missing mothers is that there are so many women in jail and in prison. That has something to do with it, even though there are far, far more men in jail and in prison. But again, at the heart of the argument, yes, indeed, this is what we've been trying to do in the society, in public policy, going back to the 1960s, support women and their children who are in difficult situations. And it has been the right thing to try. It hasn't always worked real well. You can make a real good argument it has made matters worse because it has made men less economically necessary when it comes to raising a child. But again, kids do best on average with two parents, not one, a mother and a father. So yes, we should do anything and everything we can to help single mothers, but it's not enough. I saw a hand over here. Yes, sir. It's a great variety. And we're talking about the relationship between, as I understand it, divorced parents and their kids. Some divorced parents remain good friends and they work real well together on behalf of their children. If they're in the same city, that is useful. Though you can make an argument if they're in different cities, it might be more useful. Other divorced parents hate each other. That's not real good. I mentioned a name before, I'll sound bibliographic here, Elizabeth Marquardt, who grew up in a divorce situation. She is a historian. She wrote a book about, I'm guessing about 4 years ago now, called, God, I wish I could remember the name of the book, Between Two Worlds. And it is based on substantial interviews, albeit by telephone, not my favorite interviews, but substantial interviews with adult children of divorce. And it is fair to say that a main finding of hers is that whether or not it's an amicable divorce or nasty divorce, generally speaking, again, kids suffer. There's research from another angle to show that among divorces, only about a third are the result of parents really being nasty to each other. Violence, either physical violence or oral violence, where the kids are better off if the parents separate and divorce. But in about, my understanding again, about in 2/3 of the divorces, the kids would be better off if the parents somehow stuck together. Yes, sir. Yeah, education is not the only thing I focus on there, but I'm in an educational institution. Funny you should ask that question. President Bush, the more recent President Bush, W, believed passionately in the importance of marriage for kids. And a very good friend of mine was Wade Horn, was the Assistant Secretary for Children and Families in the Department of Health and Human Services, and he was the lead player in welfare reform, TANF, a couple of years ago, the reauthorization of welfare. But he was a great proponent. We've been active together in the fatherhood movement, the marriage movement. Very active in getting Congress to allocate money to do training, educational programs for low-income people when it comes to marriage, helping couples who are together but not married increase the chances of their getting married and having it be a successful marriage. Though it's not a federal dating service, it's not telling people to go get married. And programs also for lower income people who are already married, helping them better understand how to be good partners. And hundreds of millions of dollars have been spent on these programs, these pilots. And the sad, sad news is they're not terribly effective. I would like to report that there's some sphere, some innovation, some such, that is really going to turn this around. I just don't see it. One does as well as one can and offers some ideas. And this is a, let me put it this way. I have always said, that this is fundamentally a cultural issue. It's what's in the very air that we breathe about what's right and wrong, responsible, irresponsible, smart, and stupid. And while I didn't believe that it was simply a matter of the nation pulling up its moral socks, I focus on the cultural side, the spiritual side. Writing the book, I have come to better understand the economic side, how difficult it is economically for many couples to get married. There's research to show that for many inner city women, they're just as fond of the notion of marriage and white picket fences as anybody. But their pool of eligible partners is not big. It's not very impressive. And one can talk about problems like that. One can talk about how globalization and economic demands fit into all of that. But I always come down, as I did in the first part of my remarks, talking about questions of the culture and personal responsibility and the like. Yes, sir. The American people have demonstrated vividly they don't want that to happen. The no-fault divorce revolution in about the early 1970s or so, late 60s, I guess, started in California. The first no-fault divorce law was signed by Ronald Reagan. Every state now has no-fault divorce laws. There has been a movement in last decade or so for something called covenant marriages, whereby a couple is getting married and they sign a piece of paper that says if we are to get divorced, we have to jump through additional hoops. That movement has not taken off. Louisiana passed the law. As far as I know, no other state has. We did some survey work. American Experiment did some survey work about 20 years ago to our aim, and it was all legit, absolutely first-rate polling operation, all scientifically valid, not biased. We wanted to demonstrate that the state of Minnesota, the people in the state of Minnesota are actually more conservative than many people assume. And we were right on many issues. We were wrong on no-fault divorce. People don't want to give it up. And when you think about it, it's one of the few areas where two people sign a contract and one person can just vamoose. I would like to see it tightened a bit, but there's no great stomach for it, from what I can see, for that out there. Yes, ma'am. I don't want to bring religion into public schools, not just church-state relation questions, but the schools would muck it up. They wouldn't do it well. One of the reasons, maybe there are two reasons that I talk about religious schools where this is concerned. One has to do with, as I've been saying, it can provide some nurturing. My wife, when she ran a homeless shelter, ran a couple, she did it in this particular instance out of a Lutheran church. So while they got Hennepin County money and various governmental units gave them some money, most of the money was private, but it was fundamentally a private institution. And if she was counseling someone, she could theoretically put her hand on the other person's hand. Do that in government, you may get grieved against. She could say, God loves you. She could talk in those kinds of terms. Can't do that in public secular settings. Now, that's not going to be the magic answer for lots of folks, but it might help some. The other, beyond the nurturing, in the way I've been using it, notion, there is some research to show that while low-income kids, maybe particularly African-American kids, who have vouchers in the few places there are vouchers, and attend Catholic schools and Lutheran schools and Christian schools, that while their test scores don't necessarily go up a whole bunch, they're more likely to graduate high school than their peers back in the public schools, which is no small matter. At least it gives them a chance to have a decent life. Let's see, let me get a couple of folks here. Who hasn't asked a question, who so chooses? Yes, sir. Yeah. I'm sorry, a little louder. Well, first of all, there is just about a perfect correlation. The most affluent families, the kids in the most affluent families do the best in school, and you work your way down. It's just about perfect. So families with incomes in the middle, their kids perform on SAT scores and so on and so forth. NAEP scores in the middle, you work your way down. What you're speaking about is the kinds of arguments going on in presidential races now. And I assure you, as you know, and for a variety of reasons, conservatives are not big on talking about income redistribution. Now, without necessarily knowing about it, conservatives endorse it all the time. Progressive tax rates, it's income redistribution. If you have welfare programs and dollars are going to those programs, and most conservatives are not arguing against their total elimination. But it is simply not a free market idea and is not good for overall productivity and growth, I would argue, to move away from, in essence, a free market philosophy. It's a socialist would say yes, a conservative would say no. I'm a conservative. We can dig deeper, but I don't know of a socialist nation where the standard of living for folks across the board are, those standards of living are as strong as they are here, or at least the possibilities of people doing well here. Yes, sir. If I can, the Scandinavian nations are not consistently as socialist as you might imagine, and I assure you that kids growing up in single-parent homes in Sweden don't do as well as other Swedish kids. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I've been working on it for 30 years. Yeah, sure. Sure. No, if it were easy to get vouchers adopted more than they currently are, it would have been done because lots and lots of people have been working at it. To get it done? The first person who spoke in some detail about vouchers was Milton Friedman, the free market economist, in the book Free to Choose and other things in the mid-1950s. So it started off as a libertarian argument. In many respects now, the driving force is not free market economics. It's a matter of saving whole generations of poor and minority kids. And I got to tell you, it's more of that that gets me out of bed in the morning to work on the issue than celebrating libertarian free market ideas. There have been a couple of, all right, let me do this way. Milwaukee was really the first public school system, or I should say Milwaukee was the first city in Wisconsin, the first state, that adopted a voucher program for low-income kids in Milwaukee. So I assure you the school board in Milwaukee, they were not thrilled about that. And this goes back 15 years, let's say. How did it happen? It was this very interesting coalition that had Tommy Thompson, conservative Republican governor, and rural Republicans in Wisconsin, joining forces with a woman by the name of Polly, I'm just blanking on her last name, Polly Williams, African-American woman, state legislator, had chaired Jesse Jackson's 2 campaigns for president. So you had the left and you had the right. You had many African-American legislators from Milwaukee joining with these rural Republican white legislators, overcoming the opposition of the entire educational establishment, starting with the teacher unions. Teacher unions really, for reasons we get into later, they don't like this. That success has not been repeated too many places. Cleveland, DC is another interesting area. There have been a number of privately funded voucher programs in cities across the country, but on balance, guys like me have simply lost. What would work best in Minnesota? I used to be the chair of various school choice organizations in the state, and I would always say we were the best organized school choice movement you could ever imagine. We had a great success in 1997 with tax credits when Arnie Carlson was governor, but we were terribly white. We will not have more vouchers, I would argue, in this country until more poor people, more people of color demand them. Too many people of color think it's some kind of ploy by conservative Republicans. It is not. But once more people of color demand more educational options, then Democratic legislators and Democratic governors will have to make a decision. Do they side with their constituencies, the people I've just mentioned, or do they side with teacher unions? And it's a very, very difficult decision for them to make. John Brandel, the final point. John Brandel, Johnny. I first met John, I may have met him earlier. I worked for Al Quie when he was governor of Minnesota from 79 to 83. He's an oldie, Al Quie. And I was his speechwriter. And Quie is a Republican, 88 years old now, he's magnificent. And John, who died about 4 years ago, was a Democrat who represented a district in Minneapolis, South Minneapolis, where I live. And John was fascinating. He was a Democrat, but had the deepest, not just tolerance, it goes well beyond tolerance. It has to do with respect and embracing different points of view, this wonderful ecumenical array of issues. And he was of the mind that education for poor kids, minority kids, would not get adequately better until and unless we took greater advantage of our religious institutions, which in this instance means vouchers. So he pushed for them, and let's just say the teacher unions at that time, there were 2 in Minnesota. I don't know exactly how it broke down, but they were not happy. And John's legislative career came to an abrupt end because of the opposition of the educational establishment and the teacher unions. They were not at all happy with him because of his support of vouchers. John was, and we do an annual program in collaboration with a couple of other organizations, just did our 4th annual the other day. John was a political liberal who believed deeply in the importance of taking greater advantage of our religious institutions. And he believed deeply in helping kids in need. He believed deeply in families and parents. Is that Republican? Is that Democratic? He was this wonderful combination. He was a great guy who died far, far too early, as I say, about 4 years ago, about age 71, I think. So with that, I think we bring this to a close. I think we're eating pizza someplace else now. The book is, as I say, $10, marked down from a much higher number. And I do appreciate it. I've had a good time. Thank you.